Well, we're back for another live stream. No one is more surprised at this than I am. Hello. Well, we are back for the second live stream, and we have fixed some bugs. Hopefully, the sound is a lot better. I've done a lot to hopefully improve the sound. We did discover one problem last time with the sound where it wasn't coming in on stereo. So that's now been resolved. Hopefully it's a little louder too. Again, please let me know the sound quality in the chat so that I can actually sort of make minor adjustments. And I have to admit, it's not the best sound device audio interface on the planet, but it's what I have. So uh, again, tonight's format is going to be the same as last time, which is we're going to take your questions, try to answer them. Priority will be given, of course, to super chats. And I want to thank everyone who contributed last time to super chats. It does really help this channel. So, again, thank you very much for all our supporters, both those who support us through Patreon, through the super chats, and through the GoFundMe campaign that we're using to raise money for a book on the 10 plagues of the Exodus. So let's try to get right into it. Again, it's going to be roughly about an hour. We'll try to keep it around an hour, maybe an hour and a half, but it's going to be in that ballpark. So let's see. Let me see. There was a question here. I saw one right. Let's see if I can pin it. Aha! The Climb to the Stars says, hello from Australia. Well, hello from Canada. I hope you are... Oh, I hate when it does that. It collapses back on me. Hope you are doing well. Did Akhenaten claim to be the son of the Aten, the sun disk, and did Akhenaten accept worship from people? Yes, in both cases. He did claim to be the son of the Aten, and because he did claim to be the highest manifestation of the Aten. So because he claimed to be the highest manifestation of the Aten, he did also accept worship as well. At least in the respect that he would be someday back part of the Aten. See, this is one of the things we have to kind of understand about Atenism. It's not a monotheism. It's a pantheism. Everything is the Aten. You're the Aten. I'm the Aten. The world is the Aten. This glass of water is the Aten. Everything is made up of the Aten. And everything that is living is also given life through the Aten. So it's a pantheism. Everything is the Aten. So the way that Atenism works is you become incorporated in, you are part of the Aten, and then when you cease to be, you go back to being part of the Aten. So it's classic pantheism. So, but still, it is pantheism that has the trappings of Egyptian native religion. So there are aspects of Atenism where worship is done to, say, things that are not the Aten, with the understanding that they are really representations of the Aten. So I hope that answers your question. Thank you very much for that question. It was a good one. And I always appreciate a good question. So, let's see if I can question here. Wanted to know if it's true. Okay. I'm gonna take this one here. This one's a kind of an offbeat question. From Young Spiritual Warrior. Hello, enjoy your work. I wanted to know if it is true that cutting the tip of someone's nose was a capital punishment. If so, why such a punishment? Okay. Yes, it was a punishment in ancient Egypt that you could have your nose or ears cut off. Now, the reason why the nose is because a person who's had their nose removed is very, very disfigured. And you can. This was a punishment that was even used in, say, the American in the American West during, say, frontier days. Native American tribes would use this as a punishment, and there are some photographs of Native Americans who had their nose cut off, and it's not pretty. It's very disfiguring, and it really mars one for life. So it was really a serious punishment. So you wouldn't figure that the nose would play that much into how the face looks, but without it, it's almost grotesque. So it was a very serious punishment, and we have to view it that way because the consequences of it for the person was he or she almost became a societal pariah because people couldn't stand to look at them. So it's serious, and it was a punishment that was sometimes used for, say, adultery. So in a case where there was a grievous, open, community disturbing adultery, it was a punishment that was sometimes done instead of, say, the death penalty. Now, the death penalty rarely was applied to cases of adultery, but it could have. There was that potential for it to have been used in cases of adultery. Oftentimes, they would pick something like the cutting off of ears or a nose instead of the death penalty. More often than not, cases of adultery, if they were sort of hush hush, end up in divorce. That was the most common, right? But those alternative punishments could have happened in that case. So I hope that answers your question. That was a great question. Thank you very much. Okay. That. Let's see. Okay, Orthodox of USA. Thank you again for joining us. In ancient Egypt, was Pharaoh allowed? I'm going to catch that super chat before it goes away. JD Freeze, I'll get to your question in a moment. Let's see. Try to get back to Orthodox use. Okay, was the Pharaoh allowed to confiscate anyone's property for any reason, or was that not allowed? It generally wasn't allowed. Pharaoh did have certain prerogatives, rights, and initiatives that he was able to do, but he also had to obey a long-standing judicial tradition. And in that respect, Pharaoh was no more powerful than, say, any other local magistrate. Now, the thing is, Pharaoh already had all the land, all the power, and everything else. So it was more or less there was really nothing that he wanted from the average commoner that he could take away anyway. So most of the arable land in Egypt was already owned by land grants or people who had been, say, rewarded for past service. So in that respect, there was very little that could have been that the Pharaoh could just take. It would be a violation of precedent of the gods for him to take another man's wife. So that even that would never happen. Now he could woo another wife, a man's wife. He could encourage the wife to divorce her husband, and then the wife could marry Pharaoh. That could happen, but he couldn't just simply arbitrarily take any woman he wanted. So that was off limits. So there was things that he could do and things that he couldn't do. He couldn't arbitrarily exercise the death penalty there, and he couldn't even orchestrate a beating without just cause. So there were limits to Pharaoh's power. There weren't a lot of limits, but there were actual limits. So I hope that answers your question. Thank you very much. Okay. JD3s gave a $5 super chat. Thank you very much. What do you think of the internal ramp theory of pyramid construction? I don't think it's a very good theory. I think a better theory is the ramp theory that was proposed recently by Roland Enmarsh. Now, Roland Enmarsh did a lot of work at the quarries at Hatnub. And at those quarries, he discovered how they were able to get large blocks up relatively sharp inclined ramps. And it was basically a set of basically two poles and basically using leverage to pull the blocks up the ramps. So we are starting to see a lot more evidence of these sort of constructions at the pyramid sites. So, for example, at the Meidum Pyramid, we see traces of these constructions. We also are coming to terms with the fact that a lot of those bricks weren't actually dragged to their location; they were floated in. A lot of the pyramids had ports. Like, for example, they actually discovered a port right in front of the Sphinx and the Sphinx Temple, where ships would come in and just drop the blocks right off there, and then they would just sort of take it the rest of the way. There's even a channel that goes like really, really deep into the Giza Plateau, where they could just get those blocks closer to the final destination. So I don't think the internal ramp construction theory has much merit, but I think ramps themselves still have are the best explanation for the construction of the pyramids. And again, Roland Enmarsh has done really, really great work here and has really sort of nailed it as to how they could get such heavy blocks up such steep inclines with relatively little, say, labor. So again, I think Roland's is the best theory we've got at the moment. So I hope that answers your question. Okay, let's see what else we got. All right, let's see this one here. Isn't that right? Abdul Radi, why was my, I presume, question skipped? Was it a bad question? No, it wasn't a bad question, but I can't answer everything. If you could repost, I mean, frankly, these things scroll off, and I have to sort of pick and choose, and I try to go cover as much ground as I possibly can as I do these question and answer service episodes. So I didn't intentionally skip your question. It wasn't a bad question. I just am trying to keep a pace here going that sort of everyone gets answered. And And frankly, it's a little overwhelming to see all this sort of scroll off sometimes. So, um, I'm trying my best here, but again, there's limits to what one man can answer in a reasonable 1.5 1 hour session. So I wasn't intentionally trying to skip your question, but if I get a super chats take priority. So that's just the way it is. I'm sorry about that. But do ask it again if it's really bothering you. I will try to get to it. Okay. $4.99 super chat from Converse Contender. Hello, David. My question is below. Okay. Strong's has haram being used as flat nose in Leviticus 21:18 and is a reference to people with blemishes. Is this a reference to cutting off the nose? Also, how does it relate to haram? Wow. I don't know if it's really related to the nose in any way. Haram is it's really sort of under the ban. I think it's more of comes from the Semitic root haram, where we get both and there's actually two Semitic roots here. There's one harem that means say put under the ban, put under older translations will say under the curse, but it's basically a it's consigned for destruction or consigned to God. So we see this term also in Arabic too. When the Arabs talk about the pyramids, they talk about harem as being a grave site that you don't go to, even though they all go to it these days. The other root for harem is where we get the word harem, which is a collection of wives that a king would have. And the two roots are distinct. They're separate etymologically and historically. But I haven't heard of harem being used for, say, a flat nose. That one's new to me. So that's new to me. But then again, I don't use Strong's Concordance. I don't like Strong's Concordance. Honestly, any sort of commentary or concordance that tries to encapsulate it all in one volume can't be very good. So there are dictionaries I think that are really good, especially these days. But I think Strong's tries to overreach, and frankly, Strong's was almost outdated entirely when the Oxyrhynchi papyri were discovered in the 1870s. That changed how we viewed a lot of ancient languages. I think it's unfortunate that Strong's Concordance continues to be reprinted. This is not a very good concordance. So I would recommend a different one, like Halot or Bagdi, if for the New Testament. There are some really great dictionaries out there that are much better. So that's my opinion of Strong's. So I hope that answered the question. Okay, let's see what's next here. Converse says, I know that this is why it was weird, but in context it seemed to be talking about blindness and other defects. Okay, if it's talking about blindness and other defects here, it definitely then means, say, it is forbidden. It's disqualified. So it has that. It is taking say the lexical meaning of being forbidden, consigned, as it were. So it is along that lines, but it in that case it's not talking about flat nosed. So I giving me the context there does actually help. Okay. I'm going to take your message. Okay. So you did post it again. Okay, I wrote I'm a major fan of your work. Well, thank you. Uh I was having problems with the view that monotheism wasn't there before Moses. In the book, did I not bring you out? Question continues. One of the authors mentioned that since the Bible claims it to be that there is no idols of God, it would be difficult to find evidence. Since Israelites don't have idols, how could we rule out monotheism among them since there is no way of knowing if a monotheist existed because they didn't leave the same evidence that polytheism would leave? How would you fit the events of the Book of Judges? Oh, sorry. Okay. Monotheism. Okay. Now, part of it is that we do have, say, the Bible attesting to the fact that that God led the people out of Egypt who did not know him by that name. Now, I'm aware of Michael Heiser's recent popularization of taking that verse and turning it into the question. Did I not reveal myself to you by that name? I don't like Heiser's solution here. I think Heiser's solution isn't good. The problem with Heiser's solution is he's taking a Hebrew text that has no interrogative markers and then using, say, the context to turn it into a question. And I don't think the context here is strong enough to turn it into a question. This also leads to the problem where you could take any verse in the Bible, turn it into a question to invert its meaning. So there's a lot of room for mischief there, and I'm not comfortable with Heiser's solution. So I think we do have to deal with the fact that the Israelites didn't know who Yahweh was when they came to when they were liberated from Egypt. Okay. Now we also have, say, a papyrus that talks about. I think it's Papyrus Salier 1 that talks about the Hyksos and the kingdom of the Hyksos at the time when it was invaded. Now, this is actually a Ramesside papyrus. So it's talking about Avaris and the kingdom, or that Semitic city. And they say one of the great crimes of that city was it worshipped only Baal and forsook all the other Egyptian gods. Okay. Now, what was really going on there was that the Hyksos were henotheists. Now, I'm going to catch that super chat. Okay. And they were essentially, they had Baal and a bunch of other gods. Now, was Yahweh part of those other gods? Well, if he was, then he was only a minor representation of those gods at Avaris. This is a problem if you want to make the case for monotheism, because monotheism is not satisfied with the idea that their other gods can even exist. And I think it's much more reasonable to say that, okay, Yahweh may have been given by that name to Abraham. That's possible. And here it depends on which side of the bed I get out of. Sometimes I think that particular dialogue is a retrojection. Sometimes I think it's that the name of Yahweh was given to Abraham and then forgotten about through the subsequent generations. Okay, but I don't have a firm opinion either way on those, and both of those are acceptable scholarly opinions within the pale of biblical orthodoxy. So we do have to sort of engage what was the people like at the time when when the Exodus occurred. And from all the archaeological data, from all the textual data, we get a picture of the Israelites of the sons of Jacob, that they were worshiping Baal, Astarte, and Resheph. Even Pharaoh, when Moses comes and says, the Yahweh has said, "Release my people," if Pharaoh's reaction is surprised. Who is this? Who is this Yahweh that I should recognize him? He doesn't know who this God is. This is a guy who grew up around Asiatics all his life. Ramses II was born in Goshen. He grew up in Goshen. His whole family lived in Goshen. And yet he's never heard of Yahweh? That's going to be really, really difficult to reconcile with the idea that there are some Israelites that still maintained Yahweh worship at the time. So I think that the evidence is generally against Yahweh worship being preserved at Avaris up till the Exodus. I think it's much more likely that Moses re-encounters Yahweh and Yahweh worship in Midian and brings that back with him. So I hope that answers your question. It actually doesn't affect, say, the biblical text in any way, whether or not the Israelites prior to the Exodus were monotheist or not, because the whole point of the Exodus is God remembers his promises. God remembered his promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Doesn't matter, and these were unconditional promises. It doesn't matter that the Israelites forgot their God. It didn't matter, because God is always faithful. That's the point. So I hope that answered your question. Thank you very much. I'm going to go to the next super chat by JD3s. Thank you very much again for your $5 super chat. Do you have any advice for Christians who might be interested in studying Egyptology, ancient history, or Old Testament, where to study, etc.? Ooh, wow. There's actually a lot packed in that. What school you go to is going to really, really depend on what your concentration is. Okay? And I would have different recommendations for Old Testament than I would for, say, Egyptology, than I would for, say, ancient history. They're all different specializations. But I would say if you do this, you understand what you're getting into. Because there are some specializations that are a lot more difficult than others. And there are some specializations where if you, say, don't complete all the way to the PhD, you essentially have the qualifications to flip burgers at McDonald's. And that's just an unfortunate thing that, say, bachelor's degrees and master's degrees in certain fields of history aren't worth more, because they do give you life skills that are very, very valuable. So I think that it's one of those things where one does need to say, if, again, and I'd give this advice to any student regardless of field, whatever field you choose, really, really pay attention to your studies. Don't let your studies drift. It's really easy to let your studies drift for reasons that seem very, very pious at the time, but will actually come back to bite you in the end. And I think some of the sloppy scholarship we have today in Christian circles is because some of our Christian leaders let their studies slide when they were supposed to be studying at school. So, again, whatever field you choose, put your whole heart into it. Do it as an act of worship. do I mean one of the questions I sometimes get is, you know, okay, David, you've studied the Bible for over a decade. You know, don't you find it like a dry textbook? Wasn't seminary just the most draining desert experience of your life? Actually, no, it wasn't. I have to be very, very honest. It was not a draining experience. And the reason it wasn't a draining experience was because I treated school as worship. You know, there were people who said to me, well, you know, you have knowledge, I have faith. You know, and okay, well, I'm glad you have faith. And I take a James 5 approach to this, which is, well, you say you have faith without works. I'll show you my faith by my works. Well, you say you have faith without scholarship. I will show you my faith by my scholarship. For me, scholarship is an act of worship. Study is an act of worship. This is me putting my labors into to my maximum effort for the glory of God. And I think if you approach school in that manner, you know, it can be a really great thing. It can be a really uplifting thing. So that would be the advice I would give any Christian who wants to sort of pursue an academic career. Okay, got another super chat from White Girl with Instagram Black Screen, $5. Thank you very much. Is El also Yahweh? Okay, that's an interesting question. And it's an interesting question for a variety of reasons. Now, El is a Semitic word. It comes from the word for God. And any god can be El. Okay? Baal can be an El. You also have, say, El as the father of the gods in, say, Ugaritic legends. Yahweh is the name of a specific deity. And it actually comes from a special conjugation of the verb to be. And it means he is. That's what Yahweh literally means. The four consonants have a vowel pattern that we often see in Eastern Semitic languages. So it's not an unusual verbal construction amongst Semitic languages, but it is vowel construction. It is a vowel construction that is it's a little odd in Hebrew, but it is something we do see, as I said, in Eastern Semitic languages. So is El also Yahweh? And I would say, well, it depends. It depends on context. Now, when the Bible talks about Elohim, Elohim is what's called the magnificent plural. And a magnificent plural is when you multiply something to make it the utmost. Like, for example, in some texts, King David is called Melachim. Melech is the singular for king. Melachim is the magnificent plural. He wasn't many kings, but he was the highest king. In the same way, Elohim is El raised to the magnificent plural. So when we talk about Elohim, it's not talking about many gods, it's talking about one God, the ultimate God. Okay? So that's sort of the context of El. Now, in some contexts, El equals Yahweh. Other contexts, it's talking in the Bible, El will refer to another god. In ancient Near Eastern languages, literature, you'll find El being referred to as other gods. So it's not just one god. And El can be any god. But in the case of the Bible, when it talks about the God, Yahweh, it will use generally Elohim instead of El. Again, reflecting that magnificent plural. So I hope that answers your question. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Let's see. More questions. There is another super chat by JD Freeze for $2. Thank you very much. It did not show up on my chat up there. Don't know why. But JD Freeze says, is it true that the people of Midian worshipped Yahweh? Yes. Now, here's the thing about what we know about Midian and Yahweh. We know that Moses brought Yahweh back to Egypt through his encounters in the 40 years he was in exile from Egypt, which happened to be in Midian. Now, Midian of Moses' day is different than the Midian of, say, later on in the Iron Age. During the time of Moses, Midian actually stretched from Saudi Arabia into Edom and down into the Sinai Peninsula. So Midian was actually quite an expansive territory in the Late Bronze Age. So it covered a lot of space. Now, later on in the Iron Age, Midian contracts to being just Saudi Arabia. But in Moses' time, it's very expansive. Now, we have some very, very suggestive evidence from, say, Soleb Temple that during the reign of Amenhotep III, that there was an encounter with a people called the Shasu of Soleb. Now, I think a lot of people overplay that. The problem with the Shasu of Soleb, or Shasu from Soleb Temple, where it talks about the Shasu of Yahu, is we're not exactly sure what Yahu is. It is possible, and I'm just going to say possible, that Yahu here is a reference to Yahweh. But it could just as easily be a place name, because captive circles often are actually references to places. Sometimes people groups, but more often places. So when he talks about the Shasu of Yahu, it could be a town. But then again, it's possible it could also be a town named after Yahweh. That's also possible. So we're not sure, and we can't be sure, but it is very, very suggestive. So where did the Shasu, where was sort of their home base, as it were? Well, we know that the Shasu were encountered during, say, campaigns in the very southern Levant, in the territory that we would call Edom now. So in and around the areas of Mount Seir, where the Edomites would have lived, where the Bronze Age Midianites were, there were Shasu that wandered in and out of those areas. So we have Shasu going recorded all the way back to, say, Tutmosis II. So I think the best alternative, the most likely suggestion, is that some people in Midian did worship Yahweh. And again, that's more what we get from, say, the biblical texts than we actually get from the archaeology. The archaeology actually doesn't tell us much here. I wish it told us more, because it would be very, very interesting. But we don't find a lot of evidence even from Midian that would give us more details here. So again, most of what we learned here, we learned from the biblical text. And that we have to accept that the biblical text is sometimes, too, a a source. And fortunately, the research is showing that it's a much more ancient source than, say, a higher critics originally estimated. So it's proving to be very, very interesting as some of these details become fleshed out. Anyway, JD, thank you for your question, and thank you for the super chat. It really does help. Okay, let's see what else here. I'm going to take the question here. It's pinned up there. I'll read it. Did it ever get pinned up there? Where did the pin? Let's go. There's my pin. All right, Warrior of the Most High. How would you fit the events of the Book of Judges in the late dating of the Exodus? And was Jair in the Book of Judges the same Jair in the Book of Numbers? I read this theory in a paper. Now, I'm going to answer the first question. I'm not going to answer the second question because I haven't actually looked at that issue. So I don't generally comment on issues I don't look at. So I'm going to defer the Jair question for the moment. But I will talk about how the events of the Book of Judges fit in with the late dating of the Exodus. Now, everyone right now accepts, early date, late date, that the Book of Judges was not written sequentially. Okay, everyone accepts that. Even those that basically say, well, you have to, you can't cram all those events into the period between, say, the conquest and the kingdom of Saul. Well, the early daters can't do it either. Because frankly, when you add all the good years and the bad years, it turns out that there are more years there, that's something like 587 years in total, than either theory can accommodate. And frankly, the Book of Judges doesn't claim to be a sequential account of the Israelites. It is a parallel account, and we see these accounts in both Joshua and Judges. And these are accounts that are arranged in a specific order. They have been written in such a way to be meant as pedagogy. So there's a pedagogical undertone to both the Joshua and the Book of Judges. And they're basically, like, for example, the Book of Joshua is organized and it goes from, say, tribes that were, good tribes that secured their inheritance to bad tribes that misbehaved and couldn't secure their inheritance. That. Well. Okay. And Judges does the same thing. It's organized where you start with good judges and you end with bad judges, leading to the next crisis, which ends up being the monarchy. So, if you treat it as a parallel book, there's really no problem with actually with either the early date or the late dates view for the Book of Judges. Either one can accommodate it. More problematic, say, for the early date is the Book of Joshua, but we won't get into that. That wasn't your question. So your question was very good. Thank you very much for it, and I hope that answered the question. Okay, now let's see here. We just got 2 super chats in. Okay, Instagram, white girl with Instagram black screen. Can you talk more about just how ancient these biblical sources are? Sure. Okay. Now, the biblical sources for the Pentateuch are very old. We can tell this from the names being used, the vocabulary being used, the toponymy, which is the place names, the geographical features that they talk about. They do seem to suggest that the books of, say, Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Leviticus, so on, were all written, at least in their sources, they were all written around, say, the 13th, 12th century BC. So that seems to be, it does seem to be that is the frame, that's where the evidence is pointing right now. Ben Noonan did an excellent work examining, say, the foreign vocabulary that was brought into the Pentateuch from ancient Egyptian, and he was even able to mark that it was that the vocabulary and the grammar that resulted from that importation of the vocabulary dates to Dynasty 19, but is no longer extant in, say, the Third Intermediate Period. So we have basically sort of this window from all the culture and from all the names, the loan words, etc., the cultural references of a 13th century date for the writing of say, the Pentateuch. At least its major sources. Now, there is some suggestion that there is some indication that these sources were basically then strung together and sort of pasted together. But the original sources are definitely late Bronze Age. So I hope that answers your question, and thank you very much for your super chat. Okay, we got a $5 super chat from Frodojack. What is your opinion of inspiring philosophy's case for prehistoric, very ancient monotheism? Ooh. I like inspiring philosophy. He's a good friend. And I am not really convinced by his view of ancient monotheism. And the reason why I'm not convinced by his view on ancient monotheism is that he bends the definition of monotheism. He includes henotheism. He includes say, polytheism, where, say, there's one god that sort of stands out. I think he expands. The fact is that monotheism is very, very specific in its metaphysics. Monotheism not only requires that you worship one god, but it also the metaphysics that no other god exists. So it's more than just a belief. It's a whole metaphysical worldview. So I think IP has sort of bent that definition a bit to sort of get that result. So I'd love to buy it, and I think he's probably right in some respect. I think probably, if you go all the way back to Noah and Adam, yeah, they probably were monotheists. I have no problem with that idea. I think that idea gets lost pretty quickly, though, in the sinfulness of humanity. So, because humanity is just totally lost, totally sinful, and I think we have this just innate tendency to drive towards idolatry, even today in our modern world. We're pretty idolatrous even today. We just do it in different ways. So I hope that answers your question. Okay, 501 Mobius. What do you offer as proof that Midian stretched into the Sinai Peninsula in Moses' time? Okay, there's a couple of things. First of all, that during the time of Moses, the climate of Midian, of the Sinai was radically different than it is today. It was a savanna. It had acacia trees. It had almond trees. It had grasslands. It had some springs, and the shepherds of Midian, shepherds from all over actually, would pasture their flocks in the Sinai. So we know from, say, Exodus chapter 3 that Moses pastured his flocks west of the wilderness, which was and to the east was Midian. So that's where he gets to Mount Horeb from when he encounters God for the first time. Is he's coming, say, west? He's traveling west from Midian in the east. Well, he's doing that by crossing the Sinai. So portions of Midian would have to have been, at least as far as the Midian encounters that Moses and the Israelites have as they wander through Sinai, are going to be, in those pasture lands. Okay? So what we see is that Midian the territory of Midian is much, much greater than that. Also, we also have to understand that Midian was originally occupied by Ishmaelites. And Ishmaelites, we know, were not only in Saudi Arabia, they were also in Edom, and they were also had moved down to some extent into Sinai as well. So it's not just ecological; it's also ethnographic as well. So that's where we stand as far as the identification of Midian in the late Bronze Age. It's tied really, really closely with ecological and ethnographic factors. Now, by the early Iron Age, the ethnography of the region completely changes. The Ishmaelites are pretty much driven out of the Sinai and Edom, and other tribal groups at that point take over. But that's where we sort of stand as far as the late Bronze Age Midian. Anyway, thank you very much for your question, and thank you very much for your super chat, 501 Mobius. Very much appreciate it. Okay, hopefully I didn't miss one here, but let me just check here. Okay, I am going to grab that one, but I'm also going to, let's see, Lumen Fong, $5 super chat. Thank you very much. Do you know who are considered Arab in the Old and New Testament? Okay. One of the problems with the word Arab is it changes dramatically over time. Now, there's what we call Old Arabia. These are the countries such as Saba and Hadramut. These are the old kingdoms of Arabia, and these are sort of the successors of Midian in the Arabian Peninsula. And this is these kingdoms come into existence, or start to come into existence, around the 10th, 9th century BC, and those are the earliest references we have to say truly Arab groups. Now, there's also Arab as being geographic connotation, which is, say, Arabia. And I don't know which one you were meaning here, if you're meaning the ethnic group or the geography. So I'm trying to cover both here. The geography changes over time. During the Roman period, Arabia covered the entire Sinai Peninsula, essentially from Egypt all the way to Midian. So it changes. It's a toponym, a geographic region that's description changes over time. So, and this is true of a lot of geographic designations. They change from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age to the Greco-Roman period. So that's not uncommon. Several geographic designations do that. So when it talks, if you find it, say, a reference to Arab in the Old Testament versus the New Testament, it's going to be different. That is just the way it is. That's the way that ancient geography works. And these are terms that don't stay stable over their 2,000-3,000 year history. They change over the time. So I hope that answers your question. Thank you very much for the super chat. I really appreciate it. Anthony Rugier, a $5 super chat. Thank you very much. Have you read many of Tom Holland's books? No, I actually haven't read any of his books. If so, do you agree with his view that religion, as we define it, did not exist before Christianity? No. Religion existed before Christianity, definitely. Unless he's redefining what religion means. And that's possible. I mean, there are, if you, various thinkers in, say, religious studies have various ideas of what is a religion. I take a very pragmatic approach to the what is religion question, which is, I tend to view it as, well, what answers the ultimately unanswerable questions? Where did we come from? Who are we? Where is God? What is the end of things? How did it all begin? What is the meaning of life? That's one way to define religion. There are other ways to define religion also. So, most ways that, say, scholars in religious studies would define religion, I think would be congruent with the idea that there was religion before Christianity, unless he's defining it in a particularly nuanced way. I can't see that as being very viable, because all of, say, ancient Egyptian religion was oriented around the worship of their gods. And if you've got lots of gods running around and you're worshiping them, you've got religion. I don't know how you can see that any other way. But again, I have not read his books, so I can't comment much more than that. Again, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciate it. Now, did I miss one here? Or let's see here. I think I covered the super chats. So, let's see here. RG Strategy comments, new idols are cell phones, TVs, VCRs. Couldn't agree more. Money always has and will be a god. Okay. I think we just got another super chat from JD Freeze, $2. Thank you very much. And he asks, how are the Sea People and Philistines connected? Yes, they are connected. The Philistines comes from a ethnic group called the Peliset. And the Peliset are one of the Sea Peoples. So basically, think of the Sea Peoples as the broad category, and the Philistines as one group within them. Now, later on, they all become known as Philistines. Okay, when the Bible talks about the Philistines, they talk about they're using Philistine as they, in the same way as the Egyptians would be using the Sea Peoples as the collective for those many groups. Now, as far as, because we find other groups in there as well, such as the Pharaoh Hen. So the Sea Peoples are not just one group, but they're all from, say, Anatolia. And they're all moving into, say, the coastal plain of Palestine at roughly the same time as the Israelites are moving in across the Jordan River into the Judean foothills. So it's a very I find the Philistines very interesting, because they're doing on the coastal plain what the Israelites are doing on the east on the Judean foothills. And interestingly enough, the two groups are actually separated by a swamp until both groups start invading the Shephelah, and you get this little agricultural war that goes on during, say, 1st and 2nd Samuel and the Book of Kings. And at that point, it gets very interesting there. But that's the connection. The Philistines are one of the Sea Peoples. Okay? But the Sea Peoples covers a lot more as well. Okay? So I hope that answers your question. I'll just add too that I also think that the Sea Peoples started invading um, the coastal plain of Palestine roughly at the end of Ramses II's reign. I know current thinking right now is it's during the reign of Ramses III, but we have to understand too that at the time of Ramses III, the Sea Peoples are already trying to invade Egypt. So I think that you have to date the incursions of the Sea People long before that happens, because they've already occupied the towns of the coastal plain long before Ramses III. And I would even argue that by the time of the Merneptah Stela, we're already seeing the presence of Philistine towns, which means they would have to have done their incursion during the reign of Ramses II. So I hope that answers your question. I probably gave you way too much detail, but again, thank you very much for their super chat. Very much appreciated. Now, I don't see a super chat, so let's see. I'll take that one. Mark Fofi. Is it possible to have an idea who Abraham's Pharaoh was? A very interesting question. The short answer is no. But we know of one Pharaoh that lived during the time of Abraham. And that's because we know that Abraham lived at the time of Hammurabi. Which means we also know that one of those pharaohs was Neferhotep I. And that's because we have a synchronism between Hammurabi and Neferhotep I, just as we have a synchronism between Abraham and Hammurabi. So Neferhotep I would have lived at the same time as Abraham. Now, was this the pharaoh? Was this Abraham's pharaoh? Impossible to say. Here's the problem. Neferhotep I lived during the 13th dynasty. Now, one of the problems with the 13th dynasty is kings did not reign very long. Most kings in the 13th dynasty reigned less than 10 years. And a surprising number of 13th dynasty kings only reigned 2 or 3 years. So you have lots and lots of short-lived kings during the 13th dynasty. We don't know why that is, but it seems to have been apparent that this was the case, that they just did not rule or reign long. So, given that that was the situation in the 13th dynasty, the Abraham's king, and I'm going to use the word king, not pharaoh, for a reason. Abraham's king was could have been one of 20, 30 different kings of the 13th dynasty. So we can never be sure which king it was. We know that one for sure lived at the time of Abraham. But other than that, we cannot be sure. Now, the other thing is, I want to be specific here. I use the term king when talking about Abraham because we are talking about the 13th dynasty. The term pharaoh is very, very interesting because it's first used in Egypt during the reign of Thutmose III, the co-regency reign of Thutmose III Hatshepsut. Prior to that, kings in Egypt weren't called pharaohs. They were called kings. So it's only after during the time of Thutmose III and onward that you start getting the term pharaoh as the name of as a title of the king. So, but this leads to an interesting question then. Why does Genesis talk about Pharaoh? And that's because Genesis was written and put to paper at the time of the Exodus. So it's using the terminology, the retrojected terminology of its time to relate the events to its viewer or its reader of the day, which would have been Israelites, coming out of Egypt. They would have been familiar with the king as Pharaoh. That's why they use that term in, say, Genesis, when it's really talking, would be, in its historical context, would be just called a king. So I try to keep the pharaoh king distinction here separate, because it does matter, and it's an anachronism to call a king of, or at least a retrojection, to call a king of, say, Dynasty 13 a pharaoh. So thank you very much for a question, interesting question, and I hope that answered it. Okay. 501 Mobius. Was Hammurabi retrojected into Abraham's time? No. There is really no reason to suggest that he was retrojected into Hammurabi's time. That would be more than a retrojection. Okay, and a retrojection is basically calling something by a new name that existed in the past. Okay, so it would be like, say, calling the modern Turkish capital of Istanbul by its older names, like Byzantium or Constantinople. Okay, it would be like that. So you would be calling it Istanbul when you're talking about it in the in a past context. Okay, so it's a slight anachronism of terminology, but it's not an anachronism of history. So I don't think that Abraham was retrojected into the time of Hammurabi. I think they are contemporary. And the reason I think they're contemporary also is because we also see Elamite kings that have that are very, very similar, contemporary with Hammurabi, to the account of the War of Kings. Now, the problem with the Elamite kings is we have 3 kings with really, really similar names that happened around the same time during the reign of Hammurabi. That could have been a candidate for that that Elamite king mentioned in I think it's Genesis 15. So that's the problem there. But I think they're so close, and later and earlier Elamite kings don't have that sort of parity of similarity of name. So I don't think Abraham here is a retrojection or a redaction. I think he did live during the time of Hammurabi. So thank you very much for your question. Okay. Abdullah Radi says, yeah, carrier is a joke. Okay. I can live with that. Let's see here. I see your question, Rita Johnson. What do you think of Peter Feynman's view of the Exodus? I don't know Peter Feynman's view of the Exodus, so I can't comment. I'm not going to ignore that question because I would engage that if I knew, but I've never actually encountered his view on this. So, okay, let's see. Here's an interesting one. Mohammed Karam. Do you know of Gerard Gertoux? Yes, I do. I actually have. I've actually critiqued his work. He one of my sort of loves, as it were, guilty pleasures. Better term. It's a guilty pleasure. I'm very, very interested in fringe chronology. These kooky chronologies that come up every so often, and it's a guilty pleasure because I love taking fringe chronologies and testing them in the Groundhog Chronology Laboratory. I haven't been able to do it lately because it does take a lot of time, but I did put Gertoux's chronology through the groundhog chronology test laboratory to see if it was internally consistent. What makes Gertaux's chronology really, really interesting for a guy like me is he uses a grid. Now, not many people use a grid method anymore, where he basically takes every year of a king and plots it out on a grid and then tries to make it consistent across the grid. Well, one of the things is that the chronology is such a complex discipline that you cannot make a grid that covers all the bases. So what I did was I put Gertaux's chronology in a in this test laboratory, and then I gave a paper at Azor in at 2017. Azor being the American Schools of Oriental Research. This is one of the preeminent conferences for biblical and ancient Near Eastern scholars. So I gave this paper, and I basically said, here are 4 major chronologies, some fringe, some not, that I tested, and here are the results. And Gertaux's was one of them. And Gertaux's chronology didn't turn out very well. It completely failed the test. It was internally inconsistent. Well, 2 years later, I was at Azor in 2019, and Gertoux was there giving a paper on his chronology. And I said, wow, what an amazing coincidence to finally meet you, because I've tested your chronology. This was during the question and answer time after his paper. I said, I've tested your chronology, and it failed for internal consistency. And, well, he had nothing to say. That was sort of, yeah, time's up. Gotta go. So, I have met Gertoux, not very long, and it was a very brief exchange. But I don't think his chronology works. So I am very, very familiar with his work. I'm even a big fan in sort of, as I said, in a guilty pleasure kind of way. But I wouldn't rely on it for anything. It's not a good chronology. Right? Thank you for asking the question, Mohammed. So let's see here. I am going to take a couple more questions, and then I'm going to call it a night here. So let's see here. I'm going to take this one. This one's kind of interesting. This generation says, was Egyptian style music we hear today a real representation of actual music in ancient times? We have no way of knowing, honestly. As far as we know, the Egyptians did not record their music. They did not. They didn't have any musical notation, as far as we know. They might have, but we haven't discovered it yet. We know about some of their instruments. We've covered some of their instruments. They would use the sistrum, they would use cymbals, and they used a lyre, a large harp-like instrument. But as far as tuning, as far as keys, as far as anything that we would recognize as music, we just don't have any knowledge there. And there are people out there that really, really specialize in Egyptian music. But even they will be the first people to admit that we have no idea what it sounded like. We can guess, but the Egyptian style music that we would say is modern music from Egypt has probably no relationship to the music of the past. Modern, say, Egyptian Arabic music has instruments that they didn't have back then. They have string instruments today that they just don't use in the past. So I would say that very like the oud. The oud was invented during Arabic times, so it was not an instrument used in ancient Egypt. Great instrument. I would have loved to have gotten my hands on a really nice oud, but it's not a classical ancient Egyptian instrument. So there's not much more we can say about Egyptian music other than that at the moment. But thank you very much for the question. Very interesting question. We got a super chat here again from Anthony. Thank you very much. $5 super chat. Very much appreciate the super chats. Could you recommend sources on ancient Nubia, Kerma, Cush, etc.? There don't seem to be many books out there. Wow. Yeah. Nubian studies is a difficult discipline. The archaeology, there has been archaeology done in Nubia, in what's called, in the Kerma period, in the Kushite kingdoms. It's been more problematic in recent years with the civil war that's happened in Sudan. It's I'm not. I think there have been some works done on this. I'm not a specialist in Nubian studies. I wish I knew more about it, but it's not really my field. So it's difficult for me to really say a lot about what or any, say, popular works on Nubia. And I think your observation is correct. There isn't a lot of popular works on this. There are very few specialists that do Nubia. Frankly, it's not that, for a lot of Egyptologists going into the field, it's not that interesting. Some people find it fascinating. I knew one professor at University of Toronto who was really fascinated by it, but I'm not sure there's been much work done for the lay reader out there on this. So, unfortunately, I cannot recommend anything because I don't know of anything good on the subject. But if I do ever run across something, I will be sure to let you know. So, again, I'm sorry I couldn't be more help there, but it's sort of outside my specialty. But thank you very much for the super chat. I very much appreciate it. And I thank you for your support of this channel. So, I think we've got time for one more question. Any other questions? One more. Oh, I'll take this one. Again, JD Freeze. Not a super chat, but let's see. Let's replace the pin. But it is a good question because I think ancient Egypt in the Bible. What in your opinion are the biggest puzzles in biblical history that you think scholars should work on in the future? Okay. I think that one of the most daunting things is the numbers of the Exodus, the census numbers. How many people left Egypt during the Exodus? This is one of the most daunting, unanswered questions in the Bible. It's a daunting question that needs, say, a PhD level dissertation done on. That work has not been done. This is a question that's not going to be answered by, say, a peer-reviewed article is not going to cut it for this one. This is an issue that is as tricky as the reconciling of the the king's list of Israel versus the compared to the king's list of Judah. And it took Edwin Thiele his dissertation and, frankly, 3 revisions of that dissertation afterwards to get the solution to that problem, because it is a big, intractable problem. And I think when we talk about the census numbers in, say, Exodus and Numbers, I think we are talking about a problem that is on that scale. That it is, and I don't think it's unsolvable. I think, though, it needs research to figure out what those numbers represent, how they are being used, why they are being used in the way they are being used. There's a whole lot of very, very sticky issues there that requires solid research. And as I said, a book length research to solve that one problem. It's not the sort of issue that, say, a scholar would take on and, say, write a book on, because those books don't sell. And with publishing, academic publishing being what it is these days, the idea of it being publishing basically a one-problem book doesn't sell anymore. So scholars are not going to take on that issue because it is such a sticky issue. But I think that is the big one. That's the one that sort of looms big on my radar. Now I think there are other problems in that are just as tricky, that require just as much research. I think, for example, with the discoveries of Lorenzo Nigro and site leveling during the Late Bronze Age, I think we're going to have to reassess a lot of archaeological reports from the entire Holy Land now. I think there's huge amount of work that needs to be done there. This is going to have implications for the identification of the city of Ai. Ai has always been a very, very difficult problem in biblical studies. A lot of people aren't satisfied with Eit Tel as the location of Ai. And frankly, Khirbet El Maktir is probably a worse alternative for the city of Ai. So I think there needs to be more work on looking at these old excavation reports, and maybe even going through field notes and seeing if there are things that were missed that could have resulted from archaeological leveling. I think that's a huge... I think we're only seeing the beginning of the implications of Lorenzo Nigro's discovery. We're just at the beginning of the implications there. I would say the third sort of major, huge question of the Bible that needs to be answered has to do with the flood. One of the things about the flood, local flood, global flood, that issue aside, there are contextual issues. There are scholarly issues. There's ancient Near Eastern comparative issues to the flood that have not been adequately addressed. And I think that those need to be addressed in order for us to even begin to engage the whole flood narrative. And I don't think that has been done on the level it needs to have been done. So whether or not anyone recognizes it is I think going to really determine how biblical studies is going to shape into over the next 50-100 years. So I think there's a lot of big puzzles in biblical history. I think there's but I also think too, I'm also very optimistic. There's a lot of people now that are starting to look at these issues and are starting to bring their time and their talents to the table. I just am concerned that we are not funding those efforts. I think in a lot of cases, really, really solid, talented scholarship is more or less being set adrift for more banal kinds of research. Research that really don't answer the big questions, but are much more incremental and less offensive. Because frankly, anybody who does this kind of research is also going to raise the ire of certain parties. But I also think too that those are the important questions. The questions where the answers are most likely to offend are oftentimes the most important questions. So I think if we want to keep raising those questions, I think the money has to start redirected into researchers that are willing to go there. And unfortunately, scholarship has become very, very conservative. It always was conservative. I mean, the idea that scholars get to ask whatever they want, it really isn't true. It never really was. But there were times when scholars had more freedom to address whatever questions that interested them. Now we're finding scholars that have been so sort of cowed by the system that they no longer ask the questions. Curiosity has been sort of bred out of them. They've been sort of tamed to keep a low profile and to not make any waves. And so they're not asking big questions anymore. And I think that's unfortunate. Okay, JD Freeze, not sure if you're wrapping up, but I just want to thank you again for your time and answers. These are always extremely informative. Thank you very much. I very, very much appreciate the questions. I appreciate the super chats, and we are going to be wrapping it up here. Wait, something. What is this? Okay. I will take one more question, just because somebody just decided to slip in under the wire. And just because I'm feeling in a really good mood. Tomorrow's my day off, so I am in a very good mood. In this one, I am actually going to make this the last one. So, Aqua Point, forgive me for my laziness if you already answered this before, but I want to ask, what are your thoughts on the pyramids? Who do you think built them? Kings. Kings built them. Kings had the resources to build them. Pyramids are essentially tombs for royalty. You had basically the king of the day, whether that is King Khufu, King Zoser. They basically built the pyramids as essentially a kind of sort of resurrection machine. That's what a pyramid is, and these pyramids became essentially national cemeteries for Egypt. And the nobility of Egypt, the officials of Egypt would then bury their tombs around the kings, which happened to be the pyramid. This is why pyramids are not just a pyramid, they're a whole necropolis. And you can go to almost any pyramid site in Egypt and find other tombs around it. So this is just the way the national... It's kind of like Arlington National Cemetery or Westminster Abbey. These are national cemeteries that were used for the nation. And Egypt had its national cemeteries. Saqqara, Abydos, Giza. These were national cemeteries. So there are all sorts of and frankly now we also know too, because we actually have some papyrus now from the building of the pyramid of King Khufu. So we know that people were used, to build those pyramids. We've excavated the workers' village at Giza. Mark Lehrman has excavated that and discovered that the number of pyramid builders was about 10,000. And they had very, very good medical supplies. They had medical supplies. They ate beef, dried fish. We find instances of suture needles. So we know that they got these workers who built the pyramids. They were expert craftsmen. They got the best care. They got the best food. They got medical supplies. So they weren't slaves. They weren't slaves. They were craftsmen. They were specialists that were highly, highly valued in their field. And that field was building pyramids. And they were very, very good at it. Okay, so that is the last question for the night. I want to thank everyone else for participating in the live chat. Thank you very much for your questions. You guys really make this work. So I appreciate the super chats. Thank you again. And thank you for your questions. And I hope you have a very, very good night. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time on Ancient Egypt and the Bible.